Hello and welcome to Module 1, Week 2. So this week we're going to be going over Chapter 5 for classical conditioning. And next week we will finish Chapter 5 and cover operant conditioning. So I'm going to show you just a few pictures and kind of think about what the sight of this picture does for you. What does this result in? So this yummy kind of looking In-N-Out meal, a cheeseburger, fries, and a Coke. Or maybe this popular movie snack when you used to be able to go to the movies, which was really fun. Some popcorn with all the butter on top in the big tub. Or maybe a delicious cold Coke. Now, maybe you're starting to feel hungry, or your stomach might be grumbling, maybe your mouth is watering. Maybe you really want to go to the kitchen and get a snack, maybe make some popcorn or get a soda out of the fridge. All of those responses that you might be engaging in just from seeing these images are a result of classical conditioning. So let's talk about a very simple type of learning. And all of these relate to classical conditioning. So I'm going to kind of walk you through a few concepts before we get into the process of classical conditioning in and of itself. So habituation is a type of learning, and this is a decrease in the strength or probability of a reflexive response. So something like that's a reflex, okay? So like a startle response or a rapid blink if something's blown in your eye, something like that. After repeated presentation of a stimulus that elicits the response. So what exactly are all these words saying? So basically what it's saying is that when you're presented with a stimulus, an object of some kind, you might engage in some response. But if you're repeatedly shown that same object or that same stimulant over and over and over again, your response might not be as strong as it was the very first time. So habituation, and that's what we're talking about when we talk about habituation, your response the very first time is strong, but if you present that object or stimulus over and over and over again, you go through habituation, which means you stop responding or your responding decreases over time. And this is associated with automatic responses, otherwise referred to as reflexes, that occur in response to new or sudden stimuli. So this is the simplest form of learning. You react when an object is presented to you, but if that same object is presented to you several times, you stop reacting to it. So for example, let's say that the person next to you suddenly claps their hands really loud. Okay, what might happen? You might startle quite a bit, right? If you weren't expecting it, let's say you're sitting on the couch next to your significant other, you guys are watching a movie, and all of a sudden they clap in your face really loud. You had no idea it was coming, right? So you might startle or jump out of your seat, might look at them kind of oddly, ask them what the heck they were doing. But that very first time it happens to you, you're going to react very strongly, okay? You're going to engage in most likely the startle response. It's a reflex that when a loud noise is presented to you, you startle, right? You move. But if they were to just keep clapping their hands over and over and over again, eventually you would no longer jump or startle. You would essentially habituate to the sound. So that's what we're talking about in this type of learning. You've essentially learned that that sound is not important. You don't have to respond to it, right? Once it's presented over and over and over again and nothing really happens, you stop responding or engaging in the reflex of the startled response. So here we have a graph of how a response decreases as the number of stimulus presentations increase. So the number of times you present an object or a stimulus to someone, as that increases, the startle response decreases. Okay, so as you can see, we have an inverse relation where one goes up, the other goes down. So if you think of the previous example that I just gave you, when someone claps really loud the first time you engage, in a startle response, there's a high probability of you engaging in that response. And you see the graph all the way up at basically 100%, right? A 1. But as the number of times they clap increases, that's the x-axis here on the bottom, as the number of times they clap increases, the probability of your response decreases. Okay, so you're less likely to respond. And classical conditioning is just one type of learning. Learning in and of itself is a change in behavior that is brought about by experience with your environment. Okay, so that's what learning is, and classical conditioning is just a type of learning. It's your behavior changing because of your past experiences with your environment. So let's talk about how classical conditioning actually occurs. So there's an association that's learned between two or more stimuli, and we say that the response is elicited in the presence of a particular stimulus. So when we're talking about reflexes, or what I also like to call them as unlearned behaviors, okay, no one had to teach you that when there's a loud noise that goes off, you startle. Or no one had to teach you that if something gets blown in your eye, you have to blink. Okay, no one taught you those reflexes. They are unlearned. So we say that they're elicited. Okay, that's the term we use when we talk about a stimulus being presented and then that behavior, the reflex or unlearned behavior occurring. So a man named Ivan Pavlov, he may sound familiar, may have heard about him. Even if you haven't taken a psychology course, you've probably heard the name Ivan Pavlov or Pavlov's dogs, more commonly what he is known for. And he was conducting experiments with dogs, right? He was looking at various substances secreted in the animal's digestive system that occurs when they're breaking down food. Okay, so he was not investigating classical conditioning originally. What he was doing is he was just looking at what substances are in the dog's saliva when they're digesting food. He was measuring those different substances that are present. And instead, he actually discovered a basic learning process, which we now know and call classical conditioning. So here's kind of what the contraption looked like, just so you have an idea. He had a tube hooked up to the animal's salivary gland. So that's what you see hooked up to the dog. It wasn't painful. It was just, hooked up in there to the salivary glands. And it would basically just measure when the dog drooled or salivated, it would drip into this tube so that he could measure the saliva secreted with certain foods. And he could also look at what substances were in the saliva. So the experimenter would come in and place the food in front of the dogs, okay? And then they're doing this sort of measurement system with the saliva. But Pavlov started noticing something really interesting. He noticed that the dogs would actually start to salivate before the food had even been presented. For example, when the experimenter walked into the room, the dog would actually start to salivate at that moment prior to any food being presented. And he thought, that's odd. I should investigate that. So he began experimenting with other stimuli. For example, a bell was rung every single time food was presented to the dog. So after repeated pairings of the bell with the food, what he found was that the bell alone would elicit a salivation response, okay? A different stimulus other than the food. And I've posted a YouTube video that you can watch on Ivan Pavlov talking about this discovery of classical conditioning. So again, just to briefly show you, so that's how they would do the experiment, right? They would present the food, but they'd also present the bell at the same time. And they would do this over and over and over again. So the dog is salivating, right? Because the food is being placed in front of him, but eventually when we've done several pairings, you can present the bell alone, and now the dog will salivate. Very similar to when Ivan Pavlov first saw the dog salivate when the experimenter walked in the room, right? Because previously, that experimenter had been paired with the delivery of food time and time again, so that eventually the dog salivated in the presence of the experimenter alone. So let's go over some of the terminology that you're going to need to know very well for classical conditioning and answering questions on your exam. So the first term we have is unconditioned stimulus, or the US. It is shortened to a capital U and a capital S. That stands for unconditioned stimulus. And this is the stimulus that elicits an automatic or reflex response. And the reflex response is referred to as the unconditioned response, okay? The UR, capital U, capital R. It's an unconditioned response, is one that you engage in without having been taught to do so. And we'll talk about some examples in just a minute, but whenever we say the word unconditioned, it basically means that there's no learning history associated with these things. So an unconditioned stimulus is something that you didn't have to be taught is important. So something like food, okay? Food is an unconditioned stimulus. No one had to teach you when you were born that you need food, right? You're born and you cry because you're hungry and you typically nurse or you're given a bottle formula, and no one has to teach you that you want that. Even babies know that they need food, right? It's an unconditioned stimulus. You are born knowing that those stimuli are important to your survival. Same thing with the unconditioned responses. Okay, these are responses. We refer to them as reflexes typically because you're born already being able to engage in these responses. They are unlearned. No one had to teach them to you. Okay, and like I said, we'll talk about some specific examples in a minute. Then we also have the neutral stimulus, or capital N, capital S is how we abbreviate this. This is a stimulus that does not elicit an unconditioned response. So the first time you're presented with an object, and this is pretty much, most things in our environment start out as neutral stimuli. You don't know what they are. So unconditioned stimuli are things like oxygen, food, water, heat if you're too cold, or cooling down if you're too hot. So those stimuli are unconditioned or unlearned. But everything else in your environment is learned, right? You learn from the time you're born until you're an adult what stimuli mean, what, if they're important to you or not, whether or not you quote unquote like them or prefer them. You can think about anything. Think about ice cream. The very first time you were shown ice cream, it is food, but ice cream in and of itself, you aren't born thinking, I need ice cream, or I need a big cheeseburger with fries. You aren't born knowing that. You were just born knowing that you need sustenance or food of some kind for your survival. But any other stimuli in your environment are learned. You can think about other stimuli such as a bathroom sign, right? The big blue circle with a person on it. That lets you know that there is a bathroom available for you to use. You weren't born knowing that, right? When you were a child, you didn't know that that big sign on a door meant that there was a bathroom. Your mom probably took you there one time when you were at the store and you had to use the bathroom, and you learned that that's what that sign means. So neutral stimuli, when they're first presented, you don't know what they are. Okay, they do not elicit an unconditioned response. And then we have the conditioned stimulus. So this is a previously neutral stimulus. Okay, so everything except for unconditioned stimuli, all other stimuli in your environment start out as a neutral stimulus. But once you've gone through conditioning with these stimuli, they become a conditioned stimulus. Okay, so it's a previously neutral stimulus that acquires significance after it's repeatedly paired with the unconditioned stimulus. So being paired over and over and over again. If we think back to Ivan Pavlov's dogs, the bell, right? So the dog is not born knowing that a bell is significant, but if you pair that neutral stimulus, the bell, with the unconditioned stimulus of food over and over and over again, eventually that bell becomes the conditioned stimulus. Okay, after repeated pairings with the food, it becomes a conditioned stimulus. And finally, we have the conditioned response. So this is the response that occurs in the presence of the conditioned stimulus alone. So remember, we said after many pairings, then Ivan Pavlov presented the bell alone to the dogs and they salivated. So when we talk about their salivation in the presence of food, that's an unconditioned response. But when we talk about salivation in the presence of the bell, which is the conditioned stimulus, Now we're talking about a conditioned response. Now the salivation that occurs is a conditioned response. Okay, it's a learned response in this case. So here are just some examples of unconditioned responses for humans. We don't have very many reflexes for the most part. Different species and animals sometimes have a lot more reflexes than we do. We don't have that many. Most of the behaviors that humans engage in are learned, but we are born with a few. One of these unconditioned stimulus, a puff of air in the eye. So like I mentioned, the reflex response to this is blinking. Now, again, nobody had to teach you this. This is unlearned. Okay. No one had to teach you that when something's blown in your eye, you need to blink, right? When food is in your mouth, you automatically salivate. Okay. That's a reflex. That's an unconditioned response. Again, nobody had to teach you to salivate when food is placed in your mouth. When a bright light is shining in your eye, your pupils constrict, right? And same thing when the light goes off, your pupils get larger. Again, no one had to sit you down and say, this is how you dilate your eyes. Your eyes automatically, reflexively do this when the light in your environment changes to be brighter or dimmer. High temperatures and low temperatures, your reflexes are different for these. In very high temperatures, you begin sweating and to cool your body down, right? And in very low temperatures, you begin shivering to heat your body up. Again, no one had to teach you these responses. These are reflexes. They are unlearned behaviors. Finally, if you have some sort of nasal irritation, sneezing, right? Again, no one had to teach you how to sneeze. There are a few other ones, such as irritation to the throat. You will engage in coughing. If some sort of acidic is placed in your mouth, you will salivate to that as well. And sometimes you will actually vomit, depending on, whether or not that the food or whatever the solution is that's placed in your mouth is really, really acidic. So there are a few other reflexes. I'm sure you've all been to the doctor and they tap your knee, right, with that little hammer thing and your leg swings. That's another reflex, unconditioned response. But we don't have very many other than those. So there's a few for humans, about a dozen or so when you really look at all of them, and that's about it. Everything else that we do, every other behavior that you engage in is actually learned. So now we're going to take all this terminology and we're going to apply it to the Pavlov experiments. I want you to be able to understand which stimulus is which term, right? So let's look at that. So first we have the unconditioned stimulus. So this is the food. Now remember, this is a stimulus that no one had to teach you to respond to. And for the dog as well, for most species, no one has to teach the animal or the organism how to respond to food. This is an unconditioned stimulus. It elicits some sort of response, which is salivation. Now, remember I said that the response in the presence of the unconditioned stimulus, we call that response an unconditioned response. It's unlearned. No one had to teach it to you. And now, and the bell, before we've gone through conditioning, starts out as a neutral stimulus, okay? Because originally, when you first present the bell to the dog, it's not important. It holds no significance, okay? So when it's presented alone, it does not elicit salivation. No response occurs because we haven't gone through conditioning yet, right? So it's just a neutral stimulus at this point. But now, during conditioning, the sound of the bell is going to be presented with the food. So we're going to pair the neutral stimulus, which is the bell, with the unconditioned stimulus, which is the food. And this will produce the unconditioned response of salivation, because remember, the dog is still salivating to the presence of the food because we've only begun just pairing the bell. So he's not salivating to the bell just yet, but we are pairing those two things together. And after repeated pairings of the neutral stimulus, the bell, and the unconditioned stimulus, the food, after those have been paired together over and over and over again, the bell is now a conditioned stimulus, which produces or elicits the conditioned response of salivation. So once the process of conditioning has been completed, you should be able to present the conditioned stimulus and it should elicit a conditioned response. Let's look at another example here. Let's say fries elicit the response of salivation. Okay, it's a food. Let's say you're hungry. You walk in, you see fries, you smell them, you start to salivate. So here, the unconditioned stimulus is what? It's the fries. Okay, that's the unconditioned stimulus that elicits the unconditioned response of salivation. Okay, so we have an unconditioned stimulus, the US, it elicits the unconditioned response of salivation. Now let's say we pair these two stimuli. So we're going to pair a neutral stimulus, which is the McDonald's symbol, the golden arches, and the unconditioned stimulus of the fries. Now, for most of you, I would say probably for all of you, the golden arches is not a neutral stimulus now, right? But think about when you were little, maybe you had never been to McDonald's before, you didn't know what it was. The very first time you see this symbol, it is a neutral stimulus. It doesn't mean anything to you yet, okay? But after conditioning, after several pairings over and over and over again, now in the presence of the McDonald's arches, the golden arches, you do salivate, even if you don't see or smell the fries, right? You just see, maybe you drive past a McDonald's and you see the sign and you might start to salivate, especially if you're hungry, right? And it's because of classical conditioning. It's that repeated pairing. That symbol has been paired with food every time you go to that restaurant, go to the drive-thru and get food. And that's, you salivate when you get that food. So eventually, after several pairings, this symbol alone will produce salivation. So the symbol becomes the conditioned stimulus, right? And the salivation in this case, because it's in the presence of the symbol alone, becomes the conditioned response. So let's talk about an example that does not have to do with food. This is my son, Theo. He's 6. This is actually a picture of him when I think he was maybe 2.5, maybe 3. He's very little in this picture. And here he's holding a cicada bug. So my husband's actually from Montana, and we used to go back there every summer. And the bugs there are huge and disgusting. And he's a boy's boy, and he loves bugs. He thinks they're amazing. He wants to be their friend. He picks them all up. He plays with them all. And this bug that he found at the park just made his day. It was huge. He was quite little, and on his little hand, that bug was pretty big. But when he was this little, he really didn't distinguish between like good bugs and bad bugs, or bugs that like could bite you or hurt you, and bugs that were okay to hold. To him, they were kind of all the same. They were just these really cool creatures that he really wanted to play with. So one day, a new bug comes on the scene, and you can probably guess where this is going. We have a bumblebee. And at this point, we were playing out front in the garden. I was planting some flowers, and he was sort of running around, chasing all the bugs. And he sees this bumblebee, and he had never seen one before. It was a first summer that he had ever seen one. And we all know what comes with a bumblebee, right? A poisonous barbed stinger. So my son gets really excited. He sees this bumblebee flying around and landing on flowers. He thinks it's really cool. And he goes to grab the new bug because he wants to be friends with it. But of course, he gets stung, which was a super bummer. And the poison in the stinger elicits the response of pain and perhaps crying, right? Usually crying accompanies pain in small children. So what is the neutral stimulus in this case? When we think about this example for my son, the neutral stimulus here is the bumblebee. Okay, so it's the first time he'd ever seen one. I have to actually teach him. He has to learn that this is not a bug he can play with. The unconditioned stimulus in this example is the poison in the stinger, right? No one has to teach your body how to respond to a poisonous stinger. Your body automatically responds with pain and trying to heal. You usually get a big welt, right? Because that's your body's healing process and so on. So no one has to teach you how to respond to that. Therefore, the barbed stinger or the poison in the stinger is the unconditioned stimulus. And what is the unconditioned response? It's pain or crying that accompanies pain. Okay. And it really didn't take that many pairings. It did take more than one, unfortunately. He was stung probably 3 or 4 times before he finally learned that you can't grab a bumblebee. And now, when he sees a bee without even being stung, it elicits the conditioned response of crying. Okay, so now the conditioned stimulus is the bee now. So it started as a neutral stimulus after a few pairings of being stung. Now it is the conditioned stimulus, and the response of crying is the conditioned response. So here we see an acquisition curve of the conditioned response. So as the number of training trials occurs, so the number of times the neutral stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus are presented together, as that increases, the probability of the conditioned response increases. Okay, so the more times you pair that neutral stimulus with the food, or if we pair the bumblebee with the stinger, right, the more times that's paired, the more likely it is that when you present now the neutral stimulus alone, which has become the conditioned stimulus, you'll see a conditioned response. So the red line that you're looking at here is an ideal learning curve, and you see the data sort of increasing in that direction. Okay, so that's the process of classical conditioning. Now, we also need to talk about something called extinction. Okay, this is a process when the conditioned stimulus, so after you've gone through conditioning, right, you have a conditioned stimulus, your neutral stimulus has become the conditioned stimulus. But now, if you present that conditioned stimulus over and over and over again without the unconditioned stimulus ever again, okay, so you never present the food with the bell ever again, or you never, my son never experiences pain ever again with a bee. The association between the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus actually does weaken. Okay, so the response, the conditioned response, might not occur, or maybe it won't occur as strongly. Sometimes, occasionally, you have to present that unconditioned stimulus. So if we think about the example with Pavlov's dogs, let's say once they conditioned the bell, they probably could present the bell anywhere from 10 to 15 times without food. And then maybe they need to present it with the food just once, right? And then they can remove the food again for another 10 to 15 times, but then they need to present it with the food. So if you never present the conditioned stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus, it will weaken that conditioned response. And this is what we see here on the extinction curve. So again, very similar to the curve of conditioning. As the number of trials where you present that conditioned stimulus without the unconditioned stimulus, as the number of times you do that increases, the probability that that conditioned response is going to keep occurring is really low, right? It starts to go down quite low to maybe even not happening at all. So it's important to note that you can pair stimuli. They can become a conditioned stimulus through classical conditioning, but you can also break that pairing. And that's what we're talking about when we talk about extinction. We also have a phenomena called stimulus generalization. And this is where you train or you condition a certain response in the presence of a conditioned stimulus. And then you test with other different stimuli, but they're similar to the one you trained, and see if you still get a response. If you do, we say that generalization has occurred because the organism is responding in the presence of different stimuli. They're not the same one that you used in conditioning or in training, but they're similar enough that you still see a response. So let's look at an example of what this would be. So let's say we train our dogs to salivate in the presence of a 450 hertz tone. Okay, so that is the conditioned stimulus that elicits the conditioned response of salivation. It's 425 hertz. That's the level of the tone. But the response might generalize, or I'm sorry, 450 hertz is what we're training. But the response might generalize to other tones that are close to that previously trained tone. So we train at 450 hertz, but if we present 425 hertz, we might still see salivation. We might still see that conditioned response. And same thing if we go higher to a 475 hertz tone, it's still not the 450 hertz we trained them with, but it's similar enough. We still see a conditioned response. So that's stimulus generalization. It's when you get the same conditioned response in the presence of different stimuli that were not trained. So again, we say that stimulus generalization has occurred when the organism shows a conditioned response, which is in this case, salivation, to values of the conditioned stimulus that were not trained during acquisition. Okay. Now, typically, the strongest conditioned response occurs when you present the original stimulus that you trained with, right, that you used in conditioning. But it does, the ability to elicit the conditioned response will generalize to other similar stimuli. Okay, so like we said before, even though conditioning was conducted with the 450 hertz tone, you might see response generalization to similar tones. Now, we can also have the flip side of this. So stimulus generalization means that the organism responds to various stimuli that are similar, but we can also have stimulus discrimination. Okay, this can also occur. And this is when the organism shows a conditioned response to one stimulus, the stimulus you were training with or using in conditioning. But then when you present other stimuli, they do not respond. Okay, so that's discrimination. It's when, so let's say we train with a 450 hertz tone, and then we present the 475 hertz tone. If we have discrimination, the dog won't salivate, right? If we have generalization, they will. Okay, so that's the difference. Generalization is responding to other similar stimuli. Discrimination is not responding to other similar stimuli. And this is just a generalization and discrimination gradient, just so you can kind of see what this looks like mathematically. But on the left, for the generalization gradient, you see responses occurring when presented with tones of different frequency from the one originally trained, right? So you have the highest response in the middle there when the conditioned stimulus is presented, and you have test stimuli kind of happening off to the right and off to the left. And we still see a response. It's not as high as the response to the conditioned stimulus, but it's still there, right? So that's generalization. You have a stronger response, but in the presence of the conditioned stimulus you used in training, but you still see a response to other similar stimuli. And on the right, you have the discrimination gradient. And this is where you see zero responding at different tone frequencies, right? So you've got really nice high responding in the presence of that conditioned stimulus that you use during training. But when you present the other stimuli, you don't see a response at all. Okay. Now, the way you get generalization and versus discrimination is different. So typically you do train discrimination, you don't train generalization. And what I mean by that is when we get generalization, typically, you present the conditioned stimulus that you used in training, you get the conditioned response, right? That's classical conditioning. And then you present other similar stimuli and you see if the animal responds, right? So that's generalization. But in discrimination, you do something a little bit different. So you would actually say, present the food in the presence of the bell tone, 450 hertz, that you used during training. But then you present the 425 hertz and the 475 hertz tones, and you never present food. So the dog or the organism learns, okay, when I hear this one tone, which is the 450 hertz, I know food is coming and they salivate, right? They engage in the response. But when I hear these other tones, food never comes. So I'm not going to salivate. They don't consciously make this decision, but they learn that no food is coming and their body does not engage in the salivation response. So when we're talking about discrimination, that is typically taught or learned. It doesn't just happen by accident, okay? Usually generalization does happen. You just sort of test different stimuli and see if you get a response, and sometimes you do. But with discrimination, we actually teach the organism that the unconditioned stimulus is not associated with those other similar stimuli. Now we're going to talk about some temporal parameters with classical conditioning. So these, when you present certain stimuli, so when you present the neutral stimulus and then you present the unconditioned stimulus, it matters. Okay, the way you present these things matters in terms of the strength of the conditioned response that you're going to get. And these are called temporal parameters. Okay, they affect the rates at which the organism can learn. And basically what we're talking about is we're talking about the time between when the conditioned stimulus or the neutral stimulus when it first starts and the unconditioned stimulus are presented. How close in time are they presented? So the first example we have is called short delay conditioning, and it looks like this. And here, the delay between the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus being presented is less than 1 second. So if we ring a bell, which is the conditioned stimulus, the food is then presented within 1 second of that bell ringing. These little box things where the line goes up, that's when the stimuli are presented. Okay, so you have nothing, the conditioned stimulus, which is the bell, is presented, and immediately after, a second later, the food is also presented. Okay. So that's short delay conditioning. We also have simultaneous conditioning, and this is when they're presented almost pretty much at the same time. Okay, so here you see the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus presented at the same time. And when you do short delay conditioning and simultaneous conditioning, this produces very fast learning, right? Because there's really not a lot of delay between these two being paired. They're paired together. If there is a delay, it's very, very short, less than 1 second. So you get faster rates of learning and a stronger conditioned response to the conditioned stimulus when you do conditioning in this way. And in fact, research has shown that a delay of 0.5 seconds is actually more effective than being presented simultaneously. So although they both do result in fast learning, some research has actually suggested, well, if you wait just a little bit, instead of presenting them both at the same time, you actually get slightly better results. Okay, so better results with short delay conditioning, but still fast learning with simultaneous conditioning as well. Then we have trace conditioning. This is the presentation and removal of the conditioned stimulus. So if you see in that little picture, the conditioned stimulus is presented and then removed. And then sometime later, it's followed by the presentation of the unconditioned stimulus. Now, the speed of learning in this case sort of varies depending on how long that delay is. Okay, but in general, conditioning results are pretty poor. Okay. Like I said before, research has showed 0.5 seconds, right? Half a second is the most effective delay in terms of getting a good, strong conditioned response and fast learning. Here, not even presented with the conditioned stimulus. That's not even there when by the time the unconditioned stimulus is presented, because you actually remove the conditioned stimulus. So if we think about an example, that would be like presenting the bell, removing the bell, waiting for a while, and then presenting the food at some point, right? It's hard for the animal to learn the association with the bell because the bell's gone. They heard it a long time ago. And there's always other things in your environment, right? There's always other things in the animals or organisms environment that might actually be being paired with the food because the bell is not being paired with it. It's not even present, right? So trace conditioning does not produce very good learning results. You can get them if the delay isn't too long, but it takes a long time. Conditioning takes a long time, and the response is never that strong. We also have long delay conditioning. So this is where the conditioned stimulus is presented sometime before the unconditioned stimulus, but it stays on. Okay, so the bell comes on, it stays on, it's ringing, it's ringing, it's ringing. At the very end, the unconditioned stimulus is presented, and then the conditioned stimulus is removed. Now, again, the strength of the response depends on that length of delay. So how long the conditioned stimulus is on for can depend on whether or not the organism makes the association with the conditioned stimulus, but still, we don't see very strong results in terms of learning, but it is better than trace conditioning. Okay. And if you think about it, it's because the bell or the conditioned stimulus, it's still there when the unconditioned stimulus is presented in this case. Whereas in trace conditioning, the conditioned stimulus is gone, it's been removed. Okay. So you get better results with long delay conditioning. They're still not great. Okay. Still not wonderful results, not a strong conditioned response. And finally, we have what is called backwards conditioning. This is when the unconditioned stimulus is presented before the conditioned stimulus. And this doesn't really produce anything, right? The organism already has the food. Why would they pay attention to a bell that's ringing while they're eating, right? It matters what comes before the food is presented. So this is used in various research protocols, but only to demonstrate that you don't get results, really. Sort of like a control group almost, typically, is what you see with this. So you're not going to see strong results. You're not going to see a conditioned response to that bell when you present it alone, because the animal's not paying attention to it because they already got their food. Okay. So the best one that produces the best results is going to be your short delay conditioning. That gives you the best results in terms of a conditioned response and in conditioning, okay, fastest learning. And the backwards conditioning gives you like the least amount of learning, the lowest levels of conditioned response. Now, here is an example of conditioning that was done of evaluations where people were shown pictures of people's faces, and these were paired with either a neutral, pleasant, or unpleasant odor. Okay, so basically what they would do in these experiments is they would show someone a picture, and at the same time, there would be some scent in the air. Okay, so this guy's picture is shown, and when the picture is shown, I don't know if I can't remember if they gave like a little squirt or something of a scent. I think that's what they did. And it was very pleasant, right? And then they presented this lady's face, and there was really no odor, right? It was sort of neutral. Nothing happened. The participants didn't smell anything. And then when this lady's picture was shown, an unpleasant odor was released into the room. So now we're using classical conditioning with the sense of smell, right? And we're seeing what can come from that. So when the participants were later asked to evaluate the faces of the subjects, not surprisingly, the highest ratings were given to those pictures that had been associated with the pleasant odor. And the lowest ratings were given to those pictures which had been paired with the unpleasant odor, right? So again, we're using classical conditioning here. We're pairing a picture of someone's face, which is a neutral stimulus. They were not people that the participants knew, and you're pairing it with a pleasant or unpleasant smell. Conditioning is also used all the time in advertising. Pleasant images are paired with products to increase the likelihood that you're going to purchase their product, right? Companies across the board in every field use advertising, and they use classical conditioning to get to you through advertising. They often use attractive people and images that are shown with the products. And sometimes the images you see have a really tenuous relationship to the product. You'll see commercials and advertisements all the time where until the product's shown, you actually have no idea what the product even is, right? I've watched so many commercials over the years that I'm like waiting to see what it is they're trying to sell because I have no idea what the product even is until the very end when they like flash a quick picture of it, right? Um, so advertisers are what they're trying to do is attempt to change the way you feel about a product, right? They're trying to influence you and thus influence your behavior of buying the product, right? Open a Coke, open happiness, right? They're trying to pair the feeling of being happy and feeling good with this product of theirs, right? Perfume ads, they usually do beautiful women, famous actresses, famous actors. Usually when the actors are doing it, they're usually like shirtless and they're showing their abs and things like that. Or even commercials that are just kind of funny. They make you laugh. They're associated with just sort of a pleasant feeling and they're funny. And when you go to the store, you remember that feeling of laughing at the commercial and you think, oh, I'll buy this, right? So they're not really looking for rational thinking here. They're just sort of influencing the way you feel about products to get you to buy them. There's also something called taste aversion, and this is also established through classical conditioning. So, this is the conditioned avoidance of certain foods or tastes. And I'm sure that everyone here has a food or smell that you cannot tolerate because you got sick shortly after ingesting said food, right? I know I have a few. I won't say the name of the place, but there is a pretty popular, famous taco place and I ate there and I became violently ill. I got food poisoning. And now to this day, I cannot even drive by the restaurant without sort of feeling nauseous. Or if anyone else is eating it and I smell it, I really don't feel good, right? That's taste aversion learning. It's a conditioned avoidance of certain food. You've learned, probably from getting sick from the food, not to eat that food. Okay. Now, in the lab, the way this is investigated is they provide the subject with a taste of food, and then they inject them with something that's going to make them sick, right? Typically, it's lithium chloride. They do this with rats quite often. So they give them the food, and then they give them a shot or an injection of whatever, formula is going to make them ill. And that injection, the medicine is what actually makes them sick. But remember, it's paired with the food, right? So the injection or the medicine elicits the unconditioned response of illness, but we're pairing it with food. So then when they're presented with the food alone later, the exact same food, because it had been paired with sickness, we actually see the animal avoid the food. The rats actually will avoid that kind of food that was paired with the injection that made them sick. Okay. Now, taste aversion, this process is really interesting for a few reasons. First of all, it only takes one pairing between the food and you getting sick for taste aversion to occur. Now, remember, when we talk about classical conditioning, we always say after several pairings, right? You have to pair the neutral stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus over and over and over again before you get a conditioned response. Not the case when we're talking about taste aversion. It's a very interesting type of learning. It only takes one time. In my case, I ate at that restaurant for years and years and years. I never got sick. I loved it. It was one of my favorite places to go. I only got sick one time, and that's all it took. And I think even if I wanted to eat it, even if it sounded good, it doesn't. But even if it did, I don't think I could because just the smell of it makes me nauseous. So it only takes one pairing. Okay, you don't have to get sick from the same food over and over and over again for taste aversion to occur. It can also be learned when there's a long delay between ingesting food and the illness occurring. Now, remember earlier we discussed when we were talking about temporal delays, that typically you want it to be close together for the learning to occur when we're talking about classical conditioning. And typically that is true, but not with taste aversion. If you think about when you get food poisoning, let's say you eat lunch, it's not usually until several hours later, probably around dinner time or even bedtime, that you start to feel sick, but you still associate it with whatever you ate at lunch, right? That's a long delay, a very long delay, between when you ingested the food and when you are experiencing that unconditioned response of illness or nausea. Um, so those delays that we talked about earlier where learning does not occur, that's not the case with taste aversion. Okay, you can have a really long delay between these two things and you still, taste aversion still occurs. That learning process is still in place. And third, it's specific to certain modalities only, such as taste and smell, that are paired with the sickness, and not other stimuli in your environment like sound or vision. Okay, so let's think about an example of this because this is kind of a confusing thing to think about. But let's say when we used to go out to clubs, right? That's something people used to do. They go out to the bar, they go out to the club. Um, let's say you're going out to dance, right? You're going to go to the club. And while there, you have too many shots of tequila. Okay. Now you go home, you get really sick. It's a bummer. Now, after you're sick, you probably don't blame the song you were listening to at the club that you were dancing to, right? You don't blame the lights that were flashing on the dance floor. You don't blame the DJ that was there. Um, you blame the tequila, right? That's the stimulus that is important when you're looking at why you got sick. And in the future, you don't necessarily avoid that bar or that club. You don't never listen to that song ever again. What you do is you avoid tequila, right? That's what actually took on the pairing. So when we look at taste aversion, it's very specific to those modalities like taste or smell and not other things, right? Sound or probably vision. Although sometimes, the sight of something can make you nauseous, but typically it's that item, right? It's not like the sign of the bar that would make you nauseous. It would be like the sign of the tequila that you drink that night. So that's with taste aversion. So quite a bit different from all of the other things we talk about in classical conditioning. Taste aversion is a special case. And there are both benefits and drawbacks to taste aversion. Of course, for humans, back when we were hunter-gatherers, they kept you from eating things that were poisonous, right? So if you ate something that made you really sick, you and your tribe or your group never ate it again, right? So it allowed for the survival of the species, essentially. Another example would be of using this. So sheep farmers often have a difficult time keeping wolves from eating their flock, right? Like that's a pretty common concern among sheep herders or sheep farmers. But what they do is they will inject a substance into sheep that have died. So if a sheep passes, they'll actually put in sort of this poison into the sheep's meat, and they'll leave those sheep kind of around the perimeter of their farm as sort of bait for the wolves. And what happens is the wolves will eat those sheep and then they become really, really sick. Okay. And what they do is they avoid eating the rest of the sheep in the future because that illness is paired with that specific food of the sheep. And now the wolves don't hunt their sheep anymore, which is great for farmers. There are some drawbacks to taste aversion learning. So if you think about when we poison pests, so some pests, this often happens with ants too. They'll eat only very little amounts of the poison bait, so not enough for them to actually die. They just get sick. And then what do? They avoid the bait in the future, right? They're avoiding that food that make them sick, and now you can't get rid of your bug problem. So that's a common complaint that people have typically when they're looking at pest control. And that concludes our first half of our classical conditioning discussion.